Welcome to Inside Medical Malpractice. My name is Chris Rokosh. I'm a registered nurse, legal consultant and educator, and the president of Connect Medical Legal Experts. Each month, we'll be looking at the malpractice issues from different perspectives, featuring honest, candid, insightful interviews by people and professionals with a wealth of information to share. Thanks for spending time with me today. Now let's dive into this fascinating subject. My guest today, Virginia May, QC, has an incredible wealth of knowledge and experience to share with us. She's just entered into her fourth decade of trailblazing in law as one of the very first female law partners in the province of Alberta and as the first female partner in a major law firm in the 1980s at Burnett, Duckworth and Palmer. In 1995, she found May Jensen Shawa Solomon LLP, which was a very successful industry-leading boutique litigation firm, and now she acts as a semi-retired, and we'll talk a little bit about that, legal counselor and strategic advisor for lawyers and law students. And I have no doubt that she likely provides a lot of counsel to many, many friends and family. Her education includes a BA in History in 1965 from the University of London in England, her LLB in 1980 from the University of Calgary Law School. She obtained her QC or her Queen's Counsel in 1991. She belongs to the Law Society of Alberta, the Legal Education Society of Alberta. She's got lots of community involvement and multiple awards, which you can look up. They're just too long to even list. But she was certainly listed in Lexpert, the Canadian Legal Expert Directory, as one of Canada's best lawyers from 1997 until the day she retired.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Well, it's a good thing I read your bio. That's good news. Well, and here she is, everybody. Virginia May. Welcome, Jenny.
Hi.
She's also been recognized by the Law Society of Alberta, the Canadian Bar Association, and the University of Calgary as a leading litigator. She's been a mentor and a guide for many lawyers and held in very high esteem as both a role model and an inspiration. And you know, Jenny, I've never told you this, but a few years ago, I attended a Women in Law event here in Calgary where Marie Hennen was speaking. And we all know.
Right.
Right.
Yes, I remember.
Yeah,
I remember, yes.
Yes. And it was a very interesting event, but I was sitting at a table and somehow your name came up. And I can only describe it as there was a sense of awe that fell over the table. And three people at the table said to me, "Oh, I've heard of her, but I've never met her. What's she like?" And
that's what happens when you reach a certain age, Chris.
Right?
You'll have it happen too.
No, I mean, yes. I mean, I hope I get that kind of awe and respect. I really do. But it was also interesting too because the two or three of us at the table who knew you all said what we thought you were like. And what was so fascinating is all three of us said something like, she is like your brilliant mama. She's intelligent and lawyerly and talking about things so sophisticated and complicated you can barely understand them, while she serves you a cup of tea, wipes the stain off the front of her shirt, and talks to you about the dogs. And so when I first met you, I walked into your office and you said, "Come in, love, and sit down." And I instantly fell in love with you and I instantly felt perfectly at ease, which really allowed me to be my best self in that situation. So I just want to say from my perspective, and just to set the stage for who you are and how I'm pretty sure this conversation is going to go, your ability to be brilliant and real and caring is a gift that you have given to us all. So thank you. Thank you so much for that.
Well, I'll be unable to say anything after such a wonderful introduction. I'll only let everybody down.
No, I doubt it. Just watch. I know you can talk about stuff. So Jenny is now retired-ish, and I say ish because she still acts as legal counsel and a strategic advisor.
No, I'm not practicing law. I'm not. I'm on the inactive legal list. I'm an inactive member of the Law Society, and I'm a mediator and arbitrator where you don't need to be a lawyer anymore. And I can mentor in that fashion as long as I don't give legal advice to clients. So I work with lawyers in trying to improve their practice, management skills, their writing skills, their reference constantly to the code of conduct and the professional standards required. And my specialty, which is preparing litigation, written arguments, developing for cases, and of which medical malpractice was one of my real popular areas in my own mind, not for the horror of it and the events that led to it, but an extremely interesting area of practice, very people involved. I mean, I did commercial litigation, but you couldn't get excited or sad for somebody losing a partnership where they'd really tried to cheat the other partner. You know, it doesn't give you an emotional high, whereas winning a case or losing a case is emotional in the medical malpractice area.
Absolutely. Well
and
said.
I don't do that anymore, but I can give advice to people as to what they should do if they're thinking of bringing a case.
Well, that's good. And I think that's part of what we'll do today. And I think part of what is so valuable about speaking to you today, because your knowledge and your background and your wealth of experience, just by the sheer length of time and the number of cases you've done, I think you'll have lots to share with us. So we're talking today. I am once again in Calgary at the studio, and Ginny is in Kelowna, BC, where she spends much of her time. So she's on the phone, and let's just get started. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, but Ginny, please feel free to share with us anything above and beyond what I ask you.
I will. I can't follow a script well.
Part of your charm. It's part of your charm. The first thing I want to know is you were one of the first, and I think perhaps only the second female partner in a major law firm here in Alberta. And this was shortly after you were called to the bar in the 1980s. And then in 95, you founded your own firm, as we mentioned. Talk to us a little bit about the challenges of being a woman in law at that time.
Yeah, I thought about this actually fairly recently. I was asked to write an article on that topic and how things have changed for the Law magazine. I can't remember which one it is. Anyway, I did that, and it made me think about it at the time. Calgary, and still is, to my view, a very male-dominated society. Somehow working in the oil patch doesn't create a lot of feminine men. And the whole city is very male-dominated. And the legal profession, when I joined it, was particularly so. We had an event at my law firm, which was a great firm, and I loved it. And I was there 14 years and became a partner. I was a pregnant partner, actually, which was quite new to them. They thought I was too old to be having another child, and I had one. And that really added to the memory of me. I'm not sure if it pleased people too much.
The pregnant partner.
It pleased me because I had my last son. But anyway, we had an annual dinner, which was a Thai dinner, cigars, booze free, rent the cars because everybody would be too drunk to stand up at the end of it. And it was an extraordinary dinner, and it really brought out the worst of everybody every year. And somehow people would say things that they didn't say but were thinking when in the firm. And I think it still carries on. It was an event to recognize the very first founder of the firm. And that's great. But the style of it, I have a photograph of myself. I went along with it at the time because you had to, really. I have a photograph of me smoking a cigar in a circle of men. It was a photograph that was very popular. And I look at it now and think I can't believe it. And I'm all dressed up with my earrings for the formal dinner. And everybody behind me was probably completely smashed.
Yeah,
I don't think I was, by the look of me, but it was a bad event. And my principal was one of the very elderly senior partners of the firm who had never had a woman lawyer article to him, but because I was older when I started law, I was 36 when I graduated from law school and already had 2 kids. So I was not a child. I was actually the same age as some of the younger partners in the firm. And that helped me a lot because it gave me a personal level of relationship that was equal to theirs.
Yes.
So I think that helped me. But my principal was way older than that. He could have been my dad. And he didn't know what to do. So he asked one of the other young men if I drank because he needed to invite me to lunch. And his lunches were unique for being long and lengthy and full of alcohol and friendship, of course, because through these lunches, great personal relationships develop. So I said, yes, you can say that I drink, but not enough to prevent me standing up at the end. Anyway, so I was invited to lunch and I went once or twice, didn't enjoy it and didn't go again. Mm-hmm. And we found our next great meeting relationship place was the dance floor because he could dance with me. He could never have danced with any of his other students. And I did the polka with him, which he loved. And we became the greatest of friends. Never a great advisor to me, but a great supporter always and friend. And when he died, which he did, his wife asked me, she was elderly too by then, if I, as his articling student, this is like 30 years later, would help her get rid of all his clothes.
Oh, man.
Still hanging in the in their flat. And they downsized to an expensive flat. And so my husband and I took a trolley over. We borrowed to hang the clothes on and removed them all, which she still saw as my job.
Oh, it was your job.
It was quite funny.
I was hoping it was as the privilege as a privilege as a friend. But yes. And that's what I would describe about you is you have that beautiful crossover ability to be professional and personal in the same breath and still gain a tremendous amount of respect. But can I just ask you, you've answered this a little bit because you started out by saying you think Calgary is still a very male-dominated city.
Yeah, it's certainly improved. I think it's certainly improved, although if I talk to a lot of young, like I mentored at the law school for 6 years. I think I stopped a year or two ago now. I was mentoring residents at the law school. So the students would come to me for, to train them to help them get their articling jobs. Mm. And the male lawyers, and the law school's 50-50 in female-male teachers, just about, and student attendance. But the women were still, all of them, much more nervous about the chance of getting jobs than the men. Quite unchanged, quite similar to when I was. It was quite extraordinary. And yet that's not the spirit of the law school. Right. And certainly the profession has changed. There's no issue now that females won't get jobs if they're good and qualified enough in any firm in the city. And they do, you know.
Yes, they do.
And that did not exist at the beginning. And you certainly, though, the oddest thing is what happens to women becoming, like in Burnett, in my old firm, you'd have about the same number of women start articling each year as men over the years. And yet the partnership level never increased of women in the firm. Maybe 4 or 5 by the time I left after started there in 80 and left in 94. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 14 years. So I saw a lot come through. But the staying power of women in the firms, in the big firms, did not exist because the practice methodology doesn't fit being a woman and a mother very well. Right. It can, but it's quite difficult. And it's much easier in a smaller firm where there's more recognition, I guess, of personal matters.
Right. Right. And I don't think, I mean, that is certainly prominent in law, but it's not necessarily particular to law, is it? I mean, I think that's true in many businesses.
No, it's not.
Where you start out...
It doesn't matter what profession, really.
Right,
well,
exactly.
Medicine's much better than it was, that's for sure.
Yes, for sure. Things are changing. Things are changing.
But it is that you are treated as an equal. But when I set up my own firm, I started it with 3 young men, and we have women. Well, I'm not there anymore, obviously, and we have. I retired in 2012 because of illness, but which I've recovered from. But yes, they have 2 or 3 women partners now, I think,
yes.
And it is what I would call a completely equal firm in ability to rise, yes. Do well, and I hope that's what it stayed. Yes. That's what it was when I left, and I think it probably still is that way.
Well, and congratulations to you for building that firm, as a woman, for building that firm. If you could just pin down one thing that still needs to change in that respect, what would it be?
One.
I mean, I'm sure you could probably think of several things, but what would be the most important thing you see that would equalize the opportunity of women in law?
Well, I think, just to give one example, might be the issue of, let's call it the Me Too movement, which clearly never existed anywhere near a law firm. In my first firm, I was the person that people were to go to for sexual complaints. Well, I only ever had one, because the issue, and I've been talking and working with a young woman lawyer in Calgary who's still practicing, who's been through all the systems, and it sounds to me like it hasn't really changed. If you do say something and if you do go forward, your work is impacted, because then you're considered somebody who is critical of things and might be a problem to work with. And so your work goes down, and then you don't get your points, for your salary based upon what you bring in, and you're not bringing in because you're actually not getting the work. And work delegation is a big issue in firms, and I think that it really stops. And it's, I'm not in the big firms anymore, but I have a son-in-law who is, and who is fantastically involved in a big law firm and works with as many women as he can find, I think, because he finds them just amazing workmates to work with. But it's a real issue for finding out the truth of the way the firm is working, sure. Because there's an ability for people to control the flow of work.
That's right.
And I don't know how you change that.
Yeah, it's tough. I hope it's changing with parts of the Me Too movement, although it has been construed as a he said, she said issue at this time, it seems. But, I would hope that my daughters have an easier time than you had and an easier time than I had. And I hope, on a societal level, it's changing. This is a topic I could talk about for days, as I'm sure you could.
Yeah. Well, my daughter became a lawyer. She ceased to practice law, but she articled in a big firm in Vancouver, and found the issues very similar to those that we've talked about in a big firm. And she's very beautiful too. So, which
is its own thing. It gives you attention.
That's another issue,
right? It's attention that you want, and it's attention that you don't want. So, what would you say to those partners who are practicing in that way, that you're punished if you speak up for your concerns around, inequality or sexual advances in the workplace? What would you like to say to those partners that are limiting the workflow?
What they have to think of, and in fact, it happened with one of the senior partners in the firm I was in, had 2 daughters who wanted to go to law school, and they went. And he was in the wonderful person, but in the older thinking group. And he came to me when his daughters were wanting to work and get jobs to ask me as a woman lawyer how he could help them, and I told him, some of these issues, because his mind still didn't think that they would be capable of being as successful. Now, he didn't think of me that way, but I wasn't his daughter. But same age could be, and you have to really make people realize on a one-on-one basis with people.
Right.
And if they're not like that in their own lives, they're not going to be like that at work.
Right, that's true. There's some just
They'll
basic
be worse,
skills,
actually, at
right?
work, because there's an economic issue going on there too.
So
but I hope it's better.
I do too.
The young women I've mentored over the years, quite a lot of them, they seem to feel free enough to move around, which is another issue. There's nothing wrong with moving, nothing wrong with going to a smaller firm where you build your reputation in one particular area and amongst a group of people that you're comfortable with.
Right.
That you don't have to belong to the big firm.
Right. Right. And I think a lot of young women I've talked to are choosing that where they can to get into something with more flexibility. They want to have a family. So let's talk a little bit about how you personally managed some of those challenges. You as the first pregnant partner, and you alluded when you first started talking about the highs and the lows of medical malpractice, and certainly I know that from being in it and being in medicine my whole life, that there's enormous highs and terrible lows and tragic outcomes. How did you personally deal with that roller coaster of emotions while you were pregnant, while you raised a family, while you survived the bumps in your relationships and the issues with your health that we all have at some point in our lifetime?
Well, I think for me, I was raised by a single mum in the middle of the war. So I didn't have a father, she was orphaned, so I didn't have a family. Well, I did. I had her, and she was as strong as they're made. She came to Canada when I emigrated with my family here in 1974. And you didn't need people if you were her, because she was morally right. She was verbally extremely strong, and she had no issue if things were wrong to say so. And I grew up with that. Sometimes I thought she needed to lessen it a bit. Might be good to make a friend or two.
Right.
But she didn't agree with modifying things. I remember being at a bus stop with her one day, and as a kid of 8 or 9, and a lady came up to her politely and said, "Oh, isn't it a nice day?" And my mum said, "I'm not interested in talking." And she wasn't, Well, I thought that was terribly rude, but it enabled her to get by. Now, I'm not saying I did that, but I was capable of doing it in my mind, and probably that showed, right?
I've never seen it, but I've never asked you. I've never tried to make small talk with you about the weather, so who knows?
No, but it's you have to be yourself, and yes. my nature left me very interested in the whole world, because I lived in such a small world of people, and I couldn't wait to get out as a child or a young person and then an adult. Starting university, to find out who I would be in the big world, and for me, work was a huge eye opener to see how people actually thought about me or responded to me, or how I felt about them.
Sure.
And I've always had a huge interest in people, and to me, my husband has a huge family. Well, I've created my own family. Yeah, well, I have a large family too now, but. To me, everybody I meet feels like somebody who could be family, if you know it. And I'm as interested in the story behind them as the front story that I'm dealing with.
Sure.
Sometimes it's not good, and most times it is. But it helps me to understand people. And it made a great deal of difference to. I could cope with the medical malpractice cases because I didn't mind people crying with me.
Right.
I didn't mind holding hands. it's just something that I did because for me it was developing really like a family and finding out how people think and feel because, I only had one person to learn from.
Well, I know you and I talked off and on over the last few years.
We did when you worked so beautifully with me.
Yes, I loved working with you. I did. But I've always been, there's one particular case, and maybe you'll talk about this, maybe you won't, but that we went to trial and it wasn't successful at trial, but you have maintained a lovely relationship and friendship with that family afterwards, and you've given me updates over the years on how they're doing and how their child is doing. And I just, just another moment where I am in awe of you because I think that is a juncture in any relationship where things could have fallen apart. But you somehow navigated that, tough issue of going to them and saying, we've lost the case, and all the feelings and emotions that come with that, but hung on to the relationship.
Well, yes, but it's important because part of the thing that case went wrong, it was a baby case. It was what are they called? Identical twins.
Yeah, monochorionic.
And a doctor in a more countrified area who was thought that he knew everything and wasn't following the actual procedures which you were meant to do under the College of Physicians documents if you weren't a specialist in dealing with identical twins. The mother was brought into hospital, which was a good thing for observation, and then wasn't observed. Or if she was observed, the signs weren't caught. So one baby died which meant the blood all flowed out, and the other baby became serious, but still lived and was delivered later, was born extremely damaged. And it was a terribly sad case. The woman was an immigrant nanny, and the family that she worked for had professed to wish to help her and hired the law firm. We were always on contingency, so the people who really lose in those cases are the lawyers. They lose their time and their money. But at the same time, you have done something for someone that somebody had to try and do. We didn't win the case. We had leading experts, nursing experts, as you know, yourself, and we had some of the leading people on those twins, on those kind of births. And there was a huge defense put up by the defense lawyers, a BC case, who are very much, and you'll find this a lot of times, malpractice cases at birth are the most expensive cases if they win.
Sure.
So there's and BC particularly has tried in many cases, seems to be a province that wishes those cases not to succeed. Sure. We had a great trial, I thought, and the judge was very keen and then went away. A year later, he wrote a judgment that never referenced the fact there were 6 experts for the plaintiff and for the defense. It was what I would call a politically charged decision. And the family were amazing because the child he appeared blind, and when he was born, the mum would let me hold him because he liked my voice, I think, or at least he didn't like going to people because he didn't know who anybody was but his mum, and he was crippled and so on. But I banged into the mum 2 years later, feeling terrible because you just don't know what to say. But she was thrilled. The fact that I had another lawyer working with me, Oliver, and she was thrilled that we had spent the time and given her the time to help.
Nice. And
she had not done nothing. She had managed to get family members to help so she could return. She was actually working in the hospital in cleaning environment. Licensed practical nurse.
Oh, yes.
She moved herself up in the levels, and she had care from her own family at home who came out to help her. And her son, in fact, improved.
Oh,
and
good.
Another friend of mine turned out to be working as his aide. And the boy was not fully blind. He always had a love of music. From a tiny baby lying in your arms, he loved music. And he's been through school in a wheelchair, and to her, she lost nothing by losing the money from the trial.
Oh,
that was the
isn't that
extraordinary
good?
thing.
Yeah.
That wasn't really the issue for her. The issue was being cared for,
right,
or being interested enough that we would bother with her.
That
you know?
tried, and you tried hard.
Which wasn't even an issue for me. Now, I had another case, but that case shows me that if you have, you should avoid trial if you can in malpractice.
Oh,
I've really not done many cases, but I've had many experts and solved many, many cases by settlement, because the CMPA will settle with you if you have a good case and are in danger of winning. Now, I thought we had a good case on the last case we were just talking about, but that one was a concerted effort to never settle. I had another big case that I settled, which was a huge high, still is. Well, it's hardly able to be a high. The case of it was a hospital birth where the GP and the obstetrician fought over who should be in charge of the mother.
Oh, boy.
Was the mother's condition such that she would require a specialist? And the GP wouldn't be able. GP didn't want to give up the baby and sign the mother over in her labor, 48-hour labor, to the obstetrician, because he'd lose who knows why, but if that had happened, you lose the obstetrical fee. Whoever delivers the baby gets it. And the obstetrician wouldn't take any charge or care of the case because the right hadn't been given to him. Now, I only knew all that because we sued the nursing staff as well in that case, because, and I always do that, I do two things when I start a medical malpractice case involving a hospital setting. I immediately order the hospital records so that I have them, and I have found in one instance they were changed, but that's a different issue. So it's worth getting them early. And you sue everybody possibly involved, including the nurses staff, not because you think that they are going to were necessarily at fault. Sometimes fault will appear, but you sue so that you are able to get somebody to explain the blooming hospital notes to you. Because there's never anything written by a doctor that means anything at all on the chart. And you talk to any doctor, he's lucky to remember the name of the patient, let alone what he might have written on a chart. Most nursing staff, I found, in those cases, involved in those kind of cases, will remember everything about that case. And they can remember, and they can translate their records and show you what actually was going on. And you can, because they're timed so beautifully, you can learn a very tight chronology of time. And in those hospital cases, it's all about time. And timing and doing things at the right moment and having the test results and when this was ordered and when that was ordered. And you can't get that from any doctor. In fact, I was called by a lawyer about 6 months ago trying to do medical malpractice. She'd got it was frightening call because she got a trial coming up and she didn't know how she was going to get the nurse's evidence in. And I said, well, did you sue the hospital and the nursing staff? No. And I said, well, so you haven't had an opportunity to examine them for discovery or questioning, as they call it now, pre-trial. And she hadn't. And I said, well, you know, you're very unlikely to be able to subpoena them and they'll show up at this stage, you know. So she was, she had lost her best chance to find out what had gone on. in my view. I mean, these are my views.
That's what we're talking about today, is your views. And just to recap, I think you said 3 kind of golden gems in what you were just discussing. So 3 pieces of our advice are: avoid trial whenever you can. And it's interesting. I just finished a series of podcasts with Paul Cahill from Toronto, and he had 3 medical malpractice trials last year. And statistically, in 2018, the CMPA reported that I think 80 cases across the country went to trial, and only 8 of those were in favor of the plaintiff. So the risk is huge. So avoid trial whenever you can. Get the medical.
Because if you think about it, most judges, they're not so much nowadays, but the older, more conventional end of society, and you don't really sue doctors because we're all reliant on them, right?
Yes.
I mean, you don't sue the doctor because it might not help you when you've got a pain in your chest. So and I think that probably stays in the attitude as well.
Right. So
settling, but they'll only settle with you if you have a pretty blooming good case.
Well, let's talk about that. Well, let me say the 3 points, and then let me ask you how you decide whether or not you have a pretty blooming good case. Let's go there. So you said avoid trial whenever you can. Always sue the nurses so you can get the story, and get the medical records as soon as possible when you decide to investigate a case. That's the 3 things I picked up. That's really good. So let's go with what you just said there about finding the blooming good case. Talk to us about that.
Well, I would get, probably when I was sort of at my peak of doing this work in the 90s, I would get lots of calls. Probably I could maybe get 6 or 8 calls and the other lawyers who worked with me on these cases, and not everybody chose to for good reason, their own personal ability to deal with death and dying, and which these cases involved quite often. And I would get 6 or 8 of those cases, and just on what people were saying, I was able to work out in my head that it was not worth doing anything with these cases. I have to say about half of them, we usually, if they're involving doctors, were people's annoyance at the manner that the doctor had dealt with them with. The sort of treatment as though they were stupid or ignorant or below them or, done something wrong themselves. And I think I have a beautiful stepdaughter who's now a wonderful hospitalist. And I think the younger generation of doctors are very different. They're not bred feeling that they're altogether automatically important, in personally, and cannot be sued for anything. But the CMPA, of course, tells doctors to never admit anything when something goes wrong, and that leaves doctors appearing to be unconcerned and uncaring when they're actually not. The funny thing is, I was in hospital with my heart thing. Well, this is kind of irrelevant, but I had an angiogram that went wrong because young residents pulled it out too soon, and I bled out and had vascular. Anyway, I nearly croaked, but I succeeded in living. And these 2 young men came round the corner into the hospital. They were sent to apologize to me. I was so ill at the time, I really could think of nothing to say to them except, could you spell your last names for me, please?
Which probably scared them to death.
Yeah, they did, and they ran.
Yes,
but of course I recovered, so there was no point.
Sure.
But thank God. But you've got to judge a case. You've got to. Where had I been? Yeah, we've just talked.
We're talking about choosing the good case, knowing when you've got a good case.
Yes.
Right.
So out of 6 or 8 people, I would maybe think that one of them I should look at, review.
Right.
And if you're going to review a case, you have to get some form of a medical opinion to overallly review your case. Because as a layperson, you have no idea. Is it, for instance, I had a terrible case I'll talk about later, tonsillectomy on a child of 3 who died.
Oh, man.
And in hospital, in a children's hospital. Absolutely unbelievable. And it was a failure in that case between the nursing staff recognizing that there was the bleeding was too extensive that was going on, and the doctors not following up and showing up when they were called by a nursing person who was trying to think, who thought there was something wrong but didn't know particularly. And anyway, in that instance, we settled. We didn't go to trial. But what use was that to that mother? You know, she was one of my saddest cases ever because she had another son whom she had no interest in.
Oh, yes.
And, yes, he was not. She would visit the grave of the dead little boy, and eventually she phoned me from some other province and had just moved on her own. Yeah. And her husband had the other son. Which was probably the best solution at that point, but very sad.
Yeah, so sad. So
anyway, for a case, you've got to. There's components, legal components to every case, and there's the liability end of the case, and there's the money end of the case, the damages end. So you've got to always break down a case, and it's easy enough. Well, not easy enough, actually, but you think it is until you have an expert with you. When you look at, should we take this case? And the client will always present something to you that sounds pretty much like disaster was there from day one and should have been avoided, which isn't always the case. Yes. You've got to find something negligent in the conduct, something that appears to be obviously at fault. And then you've got to find the injuries that have resulted from that. Now, if people are in hospital, there's already been an injury or an illness somewhere. So you're dealing with people who aren't fully well, usually, or they're either out from an accident or some big deterioration in their health, which has lent them to be in hospital, or in baby cases, birth, which is a good incident or should be. So you've got to then find a causal connection to the negligent act. And I'll explain a case that I know of where that was misdone. There was a case in a southern hospital. There'd been a car accident. Man was brought in very ill to a hospital, and he had spinal surgery in a rural hospital, and he was paralyzed. And the case continued on the premise that the paralysis had resulted from the wrong surgery that was done by the surgeon in the rural hospital. Now, the surgery had been wrong. It had been wrongly done, and the patient should never have been operated on there. He should have gone to the major hospital in the bigger area. But it turned out the man was paralyzed in the accident. So the whole case went forward for about 3 years. I got it to try and close the thing down when these mistakes all emerged. And because there was absolutely no connection, no causal connection between the paralysis that happened before the surgery and the wrong surgery.
My goodness.
Now, you know, so you have to be so careful. And that case went ahead, and the man paid his own disbursements, and there was nothing there.
So much time and money and lost hope.
Yeah, so causal connection. So somebody's had a negligent act occur. Well, like me, if I had died from that vascular bleed out, that would have been a direct connection to the guys doing it wrongly.
Right.
But you have to find something very clear.
Yes.
Absolutely clear. Like I had another case, a child, it's about 6 or 7, and he was having, I think it might have been tonsils again, but in a different place. And the anesthetist gave him the dose for a large man who'd been his previous patient. And he hadn't reduced down the required amount for a child of 6. And so the kid was out cold for like 6 hours or something.
I'm sure.
And the mother's panicking, and the hospital didn't do anything because they didn't want to transfer him to the children's hospital in case they looked bad, right? Which they were anyway. Finally, he went to children's hospital. I sued on his behalf, and luckily the child really had nothing wrong. He fully recovered from such a mess. But anyway, those and there again, there is a direct correlation, a direct causal connection between the negligence and the resulting problem.
Yes, I can see that. Well, that was a really easy and simplistic way to explain it. So no doubt you've seen a lot of changes in malpractice law over the years. In your view, what still needs to change?
I think that there needs to be, I would say, mandated mediation or arbitration, because going to court is on the cases that occur often, like the CMPA will not want to go to court. I mean, that huge failure rate is because they will decide they'll go to a case for doctors where they can win, probably, not necessarily on the facts, but the way their experts are presenting the case. And they will fight, and they will only, if you have a case that you can win, like the cases I've been talking about, they're going to settle. Because they don't want settleable cases out there.
Sure.
Because then that's a bad precedent and everybody's going to start to sue. Now, you just told me that dreadful figure of the proportion of cases that were lost. Well, that's great, because now nobody's ever going to sue and go to trial, right? So I fought and fought and fought to settle my cases.
Yes.
Not because... And the one I didn't and lost was the one that still makes me feel low. And we talked about the lady now and her child, the twin case.
Yes.
Very sad.
Yes.
But the other thing is, it should not stop people. It should not, that fear, because there are many cases. Well, I'll tell you a case that I settled. Anyway, sorry, we were talking about what we have to look up for a good case. A negligent act, a causal connection, and next one, suing the right people. Because as in any litigation, the larger the group of possible defendants, the safer you are. And that doesn't matter if it's a conflict case, if it's a hospital case, whatever it is. Because in that other case I just mentioned, where the causal connection, the paralysis, it all happened before the wrongful surgery, there was another problem, because one of the main surgeons who dealt with the case in the next hospital where the patient was moved to and surgery occurred and didn't improve his situation, was not sued. And he should have been sued.
Got it.
Because all the other doctors involved in the second hospital put all the issues that made the issue worse, because the patient got worse as a result of the second surgery, on him, and he hadn't been made a party. And it was too late to get him in. So
yes,
you find every name, and if you don't know a doctor's name who's involved, you put...
listen as a John Doe,
ABC or whatever the phrase is, I now, to cover that person, so that you know that person exists, and you can switch the name in.
Well, we were also talking...
Always get the nursing hospital records if it's a hospital case early, and if it's not a hospital case, if it's a doctor's case. And I did lots of cases in the rural areas of the province, because rural lawyers are not going to sue their doctors. I mean, they're members of the Rotary Club together, and, they're going to be signing their wills for them. So you really don't sue your local lawyers, your local doctors, and they're quite happy for me to come along and do it for them, which I was quite happy to do as well.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
So
that's just another thing.
Yes.
Then
we were also, can I just interrupt just for 1 sec? Because the other thing we were talking about on that last point was how does malpractice law still need to change? You've seen changes in how, and you mentioned that there should be mandated mediation, and you've also mentioned that you are currently or were a mediator. How often is medical malpractice case mediation successful in achieving a settlement?
Well, the biggest case I had settled, it was an award of $4.5 million, a child case, and not that helped the child. She's still as injured as she was when she was born.
Right.
That was the case involving the doctor, the two doctors arguing in the hospital, the GP and the specialist. In that case, we had a trial date set. Well, we spent 2 years fighting over liability, and finally they agreed on liability. So then we moved to the issue of damages. Now you have a child who's injured, seriously, quadriplegic from birth. Brain not injured in that little one, and she's been actually graduated from high school, which is quite stunning. But she turned out to be super smart, but they didn't, and all the work I did suggested she should have every piece of computerized equipment and massage that was available, and I had a very expensive tab for her life. But the issue was her life expectancy. And that in those cases is hugely important. And that can bring out what I would call the charlatan expert. In fact, I found a charlatan expert on that case because our experts said that the child should live to around, I think, 50 to 55. I can't remember. But anyway, a good life because there was no issue about eating. Didn't have to be tube fed, the internal organs were all okay, etc. And the defense had, and I have to tell this story, it's a bit long, but the defense had hired a statistical expert. He wasn't a doctor, who worked in California, and he was taking the California special needs statistics for children in the youth age to determine how long children lived with these kind of problems. So they had and he came out with a figure that our child would die in 10 years or something. Well, she's beaten that already. Anyway, this man was being hired everywhere by the CMPA in English-speaking countries, US, Australia, England, New Zealand, and Canada, and was doing very well at it. So that became our big fight. And I asked for all the cases, asked the other side that he'd been involved in, and they gave me the ones they knew, but they didn't give one in England, which in some ridiculous way. Have I got time to tell this story?
Yeah, go ahead. Let's
anyway,
hear it.
So they've acknowledged liability, so we don't have to go to trial. So now the only issue we've got is to deal with how much. And this awful issue of a life expectancy come up. So I went to England, my hometown, and it was a wet day in London. I was on my own. Everybody at home was working there, my family there. And I wandered into the courts of justice in England. I was down in the city of London. And I said to the porter at the door, got any interesting cases involving malpractice? No, I don't know what that is. He said, you'll be bored by everything in here. I said, oh, maybe not. Anyway, so he sent me to a court of appeal where there were 3 Court of Appeal judges of the English Court of Appeal and a female lawyer and a male lawyer. And I sat down. I had no paper, no anything. And the case was an afternoon appeal case. And that you will not get no. I sat down the chance of me landing there, the case was 2 hours only. Wet afternoon, I was in London, and I went in, and the case involved the plaintiff's lawyer appealing against a life expectancy expert who turned out to be the same one that I had on my case.
You're kidding.
No, it didn't seem true. Like, I ran out when I left the case. Anyway, it was insane. And the case had been appealed, and the issue was, when is statistical evidence better than actually having the records and knowledge of the specific child?
Right.
And which seemed, anyway, the Court of Appeal. So I couldn't believe it. I mean, I thought this sounds a familiar sort of physical setting, but no idea it was the same guy. And he had not given the lawyers that I had been dealing with as defense that case at all, of course. So then you realize you're really, as a defense lawyer, at the mercy of what you're actually told by your experts.
Exactly.
So that's another thing all people should do, is constantly check on the validity of your experts.
Right, exactly.
In terms of what they tell you, where they've been found right or wrong or whatever. Now, you'd think you wouldn't have to do that, but that case taught me otherwise. So anyway, I met the woman lawyer. I only had like a bus ticket to write anything on, and she sent me the Court of Appeal judgment that absolutely said the most that could be said for that expert is he might add something, provided you've got the basics from another source.
Oh my.
Like the actual records and working positions, you know. But that was, anyway, the result of that was that we were ready to go to a mediation prior to trial. We had a trial date in the distant future, and then we had a very immediate big mediation coming up with a retired judge, and then we had I came back and we settled the case because I wrote a brief of law that actually contained this interesting fact of finding this person, and you know, I thought I might have imagined this whole thing, but there's the Court of Appeal judgment, and quite by accident. And I think I'm lucky in life.
I think the world is small and amazing all at the same time, isn't it? Like, what an opportunity!
Isn't that insane?
It's
I know.
insane. It's just amazing.
It just didn't make sense at all.
Right.
But to my family it did, because they thought that some angel had sent me along there.
Oh, isn't that
and
good?
it certainly felt like that at the time.
Isn't that good? Well, you know, I could already see we've been talking.
You've got to have. So then the damages become important, and the other thing you have to look for on a case before you take a case is whether it's a case that's going to bring out what I call the moral judgment side of things.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Because there are cases that do that. Well, I think the case that we lost brought that out. There was no particular issue in the plaintiff or desire to assist her, really. You know, she's immigrant nanny without much family here, clearly no authority. And, you know, people do tread. Some people tend to choose those people to tread upon. Who knows?
Sure,
but anyway, there was no desire to assist her. Her family did. But anyway, I think it was... but the moral judgment I came across was a case which did go to trial from my firm, and we lost it. I didn't do that case. It was a rural mother, had something like 4 or 5 kids. She's a great mum, and she went and had her tubes tied. And she got pregnant again. And she got pregnant and was having her baby. Well, I didn't think that anybody would want to decide a case saying that she shouldn't have had the baby, right?
So
because
it was like
the baby hadn't been born at that point.
It was a wrongful birth case or something?
The baby was born by then, when we had the case.
Right.
And a little boy. And, you know, the moral viewing of that kind of case is, how can you possibly sue and your child know you sued to have not had them?
Yes,
right?
yes.
And in that case, what had happened was the doctor on the X-ray pictures, it showed he had put whatever you put to tie tubes on the wrong bit of the anatomy.
Right. The filthy clips.
Sort of hanging off something else like a bow, right? And that seemed to be proof. And the defense pulled in what I would call another charlatan expert who, and they do show up, and the good experts have to watch for them. He came along and said, no, you can have tubes tied and they can regrow.
Oh, come on. Well, yeah. I mean, in a very, very small percentage of the cases, yes, but very slim, very slim.
Yes. So, yes, I mean, if you're doing that on a 90 to 10% chance, anyway, the case was decided against the mother, and her only issue had been, we can't afford another child. And I tried to avoid that.
Right.
And the medical profession let me down.
Right. Oh, isn't that something?
Anyway, so those moral judgment cases you have to watch, because they don't. Or a case that I would have never won in court, because again of a moral judgment, was a case involving a First Nation baby who was in hospital in a northern hospital, and was very ill with a fever. And the hospital people kept him in hospital for a week, but nowhere near the nurse's desk. And that was a terrible case. The baby got worse and worse. And one day, some foreign, he might have been foreign, but a visiting doctor from somewhere else was in the hospital, a specialist, and found the child there and said, what's happening with this child? The child had flesh-eating disease.
Oh, boy.
And this doctor had him airlifted to the main hospital, at which point all of the traditional family things that needed done, the melting of the, I've forgotten the name, all the things that First Nations like to do, smoke grass, what's it called?
Sage, smudging, clearing the room.
Everything like that. Mm-hmm. And the children's hospital in the big town allowed all of that to happen around the child. But he died. It was too late. And that was the only case where I ever found nursing records changed.
Oh,
because
is that right?
The argument of two of the nurses had been that the child was brought in neglected. And he was dirty, and he had mud under his fingernails. And these items were added into the nursing record.
And it's surprising how quick. I've seen a few cases like that, or reviewed records like that in my career as an expert, and it's surprising how easy it is to pick that up, isn't it? You can find the basics, but you can also find that overlay of judgment. It's quite easy to pick up, isn't it? Surprisingly so. It's a moral judgment on someone, and the same thing with some of the baby cases. If you've got an unmarried mother, a single mother, so there's no one really there to support them. So what? That's nothing to do with you. Yeah, exactly.
But I think that's far less.
Yeah. That is without a doubt getting better.
Anyway, that moral judgment one with that baby, things changed after that, hopefully for the better, because a committee was set up of the community and the hospital and the staff at all levels, doctors and nurses, and I think it became less likely to happen.
I hope so. It's what there's so much about we're recording this in June of 2020, and that is the hot topic in the world right now, isn't it?
Yes, and as I'm saying this, I'm thinking, how can I say it's changed?
Exactly.
When I read the papers every day.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Just staying hopeful.
So much. Yeah, well, that's what I don't like.
Exactly. So listen, Ginny, you and I have already talked for over an hour, which I can hardly believe. It went by like about
I'm
10
sorry.
seconds.
Yeah.
No, don't be sorry. I can just see we're going to have to do this again sometime because I have about 15 questions in front of me, and I think I've only asked you 2 of them. So we're going to have to come back another time and record another podcast. It's been so fascinating talking to you. But before we end this, our listeners include lawyers and doctors and nurses and the general public, and you have such a wealth of knowledge and you're so beautifully spoken. Just answer this question for me for all 4 of those sort of areas of audience. Based on your experience in medical malpractice law and your years of being a lawyer, what's the most valuable thing that you could offer a doctor that could learn from your experience in medical malpractice?
I think a doctor should never, because they have medical experience, feel superior to their client. Mm-hmm. And to say they shouldn't feel, I can't control how people feel, but in such a way that it impacts either the way they care for a patient or the way they respond when they're sued, when they've done something wrong. Because there's no privilege in being a doctor that allows you to do something wrong and get away with it, if I can say that word. Not that no doctor ever wants to have done anything wrong. I've never found, there's no what I'd call intentional. It's negligence. Negligence isn't intent. Right. Negligence is allowing yourself to be careless at a certain point in a relationship. And it's not a jail matter, but it is a matter where somebody else, if you are negligent, is harmed. And I think many of the calls I got would never have occurred if doctors had behaved differently. And yet, they can't be blamed because they're told to say nothing and to act as if nothing has happened by their own insurers.
Right.
And I think that leads to many more cases. I've just got one case on that story. I had a woman, had a baby, doctor, older obstetrician, things went sideways. Child luckily recovered very well. The mother was freaked out completely and would not drive near where the surgery was or where she knew the doctor lived. Like, things would make her ill going near him. And we're having the examinations for discovery, and this doctor came in, and he came in with his lawyer, and I'm sitting there with my client who's about to throw up because she's avoided everything to do with him. Sure. And he came up to me and said, I have to speak to you. He said, they won't tell me how the child is. Nobody has told me how that baby boy is doing. And he was sick with worry. And he, just as my client had been so sick, was also absolutely distressed as anything because his lawyer had chosen to say nothing. And I said, the child has done very well. He's got very little. Now, okay, so I'm lessening the damages my client can get by saying that, but they didn't need them. You know?
So the humanness is there.
Such a relief. And then he told everything. He ignored his lawyer, who was furious with him, and he said, this is what happened. I have not delivered another baby since then. I am not going to deliver anymore. Yes. And she turned out, when she came for this discovery with me, my client, to be pregnant again. And he asked if he could see the new baby.
Oh, boy.
Well, it ended up that he dropped some vast teddy bear off at the hospital for her, for the new baby. And actually a kind of friendship developed.
Oh, boy. Isn't that something?
But he's gone for 2 years because these things are so slow. Panic-stricken that this was a very seriously injured child, which it was not.
Well, thank you for bringing light on that humanness, because I personally have never met a doctor or a nurse who doesn't have a memory and a worry like that in their background of that day and that case and that outcome. And you don't always know the ending of the story. You don't. No. You lose touch, and it's acute care and it's busy and life goes on, and you just don't find out. So thank you.
That
thank you.
A case in I'll just get this one on a northern case where a diagnosis of a testicular tumor was missed in a 50-year-old man, and that's a whole other story, that case. But when we did the examinations, the doctor was the only urologist for miles around, so he was forever on 48-hour call everywhere. Yeah, sure. He was exhausted. He was in the middle of a divorce because his family had got fed up with him forever somewhere other than at home. Yeah. And he had the particular night that my client had come in 3 years before, had refused to look at CT scan or whatever they had done, ultrasound, and found a tumor in the man. And he had decided he had testicular torsion, so he was not, and so the tumor was missed by this urologist completely, and by my client and my client's GP at home, because nobody knew about it. And my client didn't know he had one because he'd been out cold because he was so pain-ridden. And 3 years later, he's back in the same hospital, and the cancer expert meets him and said, well, what happened about your tumor 3 years ago? Well, that case was, you'd have thought was cut and dried, except the lawyer wouldn't settle it until 2 days after my client died.
Oh, boy.
But anyway, that is something where a lawyer can, or the lawyer's counsel can improve their way of moving.
Right. Expediency.
Anyway.
So answer that same question for me.
There's so much to talk about.
I know. That's what I'm saying. We're going to have to do this again sometime really soon, because I have not even touched the things I'd like to ask you. But while we're here and we've got this time, I'd like you to answer that same question in your view. Tell me what the most valuable thing that nurses could learn from your experience in medical malpractice.
Nurses can learn that there is nothing to fear if they are sued or if the hospital is sued.
Oh, boy.
In most instances, a nurse, I have found, I think in all the cases I did, maybe 3 occasions where a nurse may have been partially responsible for something. One, a lady had gone out for a smoke as the monitoring on a baby dropped. Now, that how would you know that was going to happen? But maybe you weren't meant to go for a smoke break. And another time, no, that's actually the only time I think that I ever found a nurse. So they're there to interpret the record and to help give a viewpoint, from my point of view, to help give a viewpoint on what actually happened, to read the scribble and the writing and why things were written down, because 90% of a record isn't written by the nurses. And if you are a nurse, you are automatically part of the legal system when things go wrong. You have no choice.
That is some great advice, and I bet you just put a lot of nurses' minds and hearts at ease, because I've also never met a doctor or a nurse who doesn't see the day that statement of claim or notice is served as one of the worst days of their life. It's terrifying.
Well,
it's terrifying.
It is. Everybody hates the law. I had clients who said to me, when I got a letter, and of course there weren't emails in those days, I was actually sending letters with a stamp on.
What?
Like my stomach would sink. And it's because your mind has to go to the negative, you know?
Sure, of course. So answer that same question for the general public. Here it is. What's the most valuable thing that members of the general public could learn from your experience in medical malpractice?
That if you think there has been medical malpractice, you should, and you are familiar with the facts, you should talk to a lawyer. You may be rejected many times because there isn't a connection between the damage the person is left with and the actual negligent act, or there might not be a negligent act, but find out if there is a lawyer you can talk to and gain some information, or an expert. I need an expert to guide me. I never start a case without an expert. Right. But never be afraid, if you think some serious damage has occurred, to find out from a lawyer who will guide you first to talk to someone about whether or not you can. Doctors are suable. And no doctor, even if he's the guy who delivered you, is if he's done harm further down, or possibly is you should try. You should check it out. Most lawyers who do medical malpractice will vet cases very quickly that shouldn't be brought.
There you go. Well, that's also...
And losing the case doesn't mean they shouldn't have been brought.
Right.
It's just not having the right features in the case. And there's no doctor that's too important or too high up.
Well, thank you for that. Sounds like we need to embody the spirit of your mother and just get strong.
Maybe she's on my shoulder.
Maybe she is. She's a part of you, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, I know.
Answer this for me then. In your view, what's the most valuable thing that young lawyers now entering into medical malpractice could learn from your experience?
The fact that it is a hugely interesting area of practice because it adds another intellectual layer to your work.
Yes.
But if you're, you've got to be a litigant lawyer. You can't do it as a one-off. It's got to be part of a litigation firm. Money-wise, it can be very expensive because if you lose, and they're nearly always contingency cases, you really lose, particularly if you've had lots of experts, because the costs of experts can mount. I think the case we lost with the 6 on my side and 6 on the others was something like $400,000 in expert fees.
Boy.
I could have remembered that wrong, but that figure stays in my mind. And so, the lawyers that used to do the work, most of us have gone. I was talking to my friend who does the defense work, a lawyer I trained to do the plaintiff's work and then moved to defense work. And she said what they're seeing a lot of, which is useless, I would say, to the general public, is self-represented cases.
Sure. That's got to be a tough go, huh? Oh, my goodness.
And tough go. You can't even mediate those because the judge or the mediator, everybody's trying to work to assist the person who's unrepresented, and the balance is all wrong.
Very good. Very good. Well, thank you. Those are all little gems of advice. And I'm going to just kind of recap some of the other gems that I heard you say throughout. Get the medical records as soon as possible, sue the nurses and pretty much everybody else who you might need to anticipate might be involved. Avoid trial when you can, and keep a close eye on all your experts. Oversee them and be sure that they're right and legitimate. Is there anything else you'd like to add to what we've talked about today?
It is extremely important in any litigation, and particularly so, I think, in medical malpractice, that a strict chronological timetable be developed. And that timetable is days and hours and minutes and comes down to fractions of seconds by the time you're reading nursing notes from a hospital chart. But that everything in a malpractice case, and actually in any piece of litigation, depends upon you having an accurate and complete a time frame as you can build.
Perfect. That is great advice. Thank you.